Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of RPG Radio. My name is Winback, and instead of trying to cram a full 100 level build into a teeny tiny 30-minute video, we're going to start breaking these build guides up so I don't keep running out of time when it comes to explaining all the important details of the builds that we're coming up with. This is also going to give you an idea of how to play the game early on in those first 30 levels or so, and the next video will get us up to level 50 so you can see the build come into a bit more of its own. However, this build, like I said, it's going to be all early levels. This is going to be earlier stage of the game. We are going to be doing some decent farming, but this is pretty squishy. Survivability is not at its highest, and neither is damage. Energy usage is going to be a big deal because the amount of points that we're putting into our key abilities are going to increase their energy usage by quite a bit, because even though they don't deal as much damage as we need them to later on in the game, we still have to get as much damage out of them as possible. So this video is going to be all dedicated to the big abilities of our kit and how you should be leveling those up along with your mastery bars. Gear isn't going to be a big deal. Devotion points are not going to be as big an issue as they will be in the next video. We're mainly going to focus on the synergy of our abilities and the idea that this build developed from. Now, down below in the description, you will find the Grim Tools link for the build so far. This is actually going to show you all the details and all the minutia when it comes to the abilities in this kit. It'll give you all the details on how much damage they do, what types of damage they do, everything that your heart could need from a tooltip that's actually in the game will display on Grim Tools. So if you are new to Grimdawn, the Grim Tools link is a community-driven website that takes all of the information from the game for each build. People can go in and upload their builds there, and you as a person can access that through whatever browser you use to see all the details, where the points go, how the attributes are allocated, even devotions and everything else going on for maximum detail. Now, obviously, I'll add some key points into this video for those of you who just cannot be bothered to click on something, but if you're the type of person who really likes to follow along and get into the nitty-gritty of things, click on that link and you can see all the moving parts for the build. It's really handy. I suggest getting used to it if you are going to be a long-term Grim Dawn player, because it is an incredible resource for anybody who really enjoys this game. That said though, let's get started with this actual build. This is a Dervish, and if you are not familiar with that combination, that is an Oathkeeper plus a Nightblade. This specifically is going to be a two-handed melee wielding mobility cannon with enough AoE to make the enemies fall apart the instant that you get into a room. You'll be seeing some fire come along with this build, but we're going to be mainly cold damage, and there is a reason for that. The monster infrequent for this build that will be integral to making it work all the way up through ultimate is cold focus. Now, the weapon in question is Alchemost's War Sword. That is going to be a monster infrequent that drops from the boss of the key dungeon, the Steps of Torment. This is the first key dungeon that you'll have access to in the game, so using it early and farming it often will get you a lot of gear, and it'll get you a lot of XP to get you closer to your first big power spike at level 36. Now, this video is only going to get you up to about 31, 32, so there is quite a bit more that goes into this build, I think, at least in the early stages, to keep yourself from getting frustrated and to keep the focus on. That being said, the War Sword is the whole reason this build even came together, so that's where the idea came from, but there is a little bit more involved in getting up to a point where you can actually use it. Now, once you hit level 2, way down in the early side of the game, you are going to want to pick up the Oathkeeper tree. The Oathkeeper tree is important because it has the one ability that is going to matter more than every other ability in this kit. That is Vire's Might. Vire's Might is the ability that you're seeing on the screen that's constantly leaving those trails of fire. It is a charging melee ability that is going to be able to clear out rooms and get you out of sticky situations when you get surrounded by a whole lot of enemies that you really don't want to be next to. Once you actually pick up the War Sword for this build as well, you're going to have a lot of very strong modification happen to Vire's Might on top of everything else. So, as it is on its own, it's going to be dealing fire and physical damage and traveling a decent distance in a straight line. Vire's Might doesn't require a target, unlike Blitz or some other movement abilities in the game. Specifically, Shadow Strike on your Nightblade side of things needs you to click on something in order to make it happen. Vire's Might is the opposite, in that you can just click a point on the floor and your character will dash across right to it. It is incredibly good for dodging large boss skills. It's incredibly good for dodging big surrounding clumps of enemies, and it is very, very good at dealing damage as well, as long as you start maxing this ability out early on. Now, Vire's Might at the start is going to be a relatively simple ability. It's got physical damage, it's got internal trauma damage, and it uses your weapon damage as well, combining the three of those for its overall damage output. You can pick up Volcanic Might early on if you want to, if you happen across some fire type weapon that's dealing a lot of damage and you just want to funnel all of that into Vire's Might. Volcanic Might will convert all of the physical damage into fire damage, making it a little bit better in that case, but don't get too comfy with that, because Vire's Might is going to end up as cold damage at the very end of this build. So Volcanic Might, not necessary unless you're in that specific situation where you have to get some early game damage, because again, this build is pretty squishy early on and things can get tough at times, if we're being honest. Now, when it comes to the modifiers for Vire's Might, ultimately you're just going to put a couple points in the early game, because really you just want the damage. You want all the points into the base skill to begin with, and then as the game progresses, you'll put more points into Tectonic Shift to reduce the cooldown and get some more range. Early on though, really all you have to do is put maybe 3 or 4 points into Tectonic Shift to get a bit of a cooldown reduction, but you're more looking for that increase in range. The increased dash range for Vire's Might means that it can hit more people, and the Volcanic Stride that you will leave behind can activate your devotions more often. Speaking of Volcanic Stride, you will only have 1 point into this, because that is really all you need. That's just going to lay down the carpet of fire, and that damage specifically will activate any of the early devotions that you go with often enough that you won't have to worry about overdoing it with your Vire's Might. Now, even though Vire's Might is the most important part of this build, it's the most important ability in the build, it's pretty simple, so there's not a whole lot to talk about beyond that. So we're actually going to move over to the other skills in the Oathkeeper tree that require 1 or 2 points early on, but these are mostly going to be utility focused skills, and you don't have to quite worry about maxing all of them out early on, because of the utility focus of them and ultimately their defensive nature in the later stages of the game. Taking a couple points early is all that you really need to worry about. Now, this first one might seem a little bit weird, but it is Righteous Fervor, and I said that the abilities are going to be utility and defense focused, but Righteous Fervor is just an auto attack replacement, and it's pretty aggressive in what it does. It increases damage for your auto attack through charge levels, and you're going to get 100% of your weapon damage, physical damage, and burn damage on your autos while you do them. Seems pretty offensive, right? But you only want 1 point into the Righteous Fervor basic ability. You're actually taking this ability so you can get Consecration, which is the second modifier for Righteous Fervor. Consecration is going to give you flat defensive ability, it is going to give you attack speed, elemental resistance, and it is going to increase your armor by a percentage as well. All of those stats are going to be much more important for your build later on, because we only have a two-handed weapon, which means no shield. we're going to only be able to use so much armor at the end of the day, and being able to free up devotion slots and augments and components, all of that stuff with a built-in elemental resistance to your character is very important when it comes to survivability in the late game. The early game, it's only going to help us so much because, you know, it is what it is. It's normal. It's not supposed to be hard, but depending on your build, sometimes it just can be. As you can plainly see with Kilrian, the Shattered Soul, absolutely dunking all over my health bar in this video right now. This guy and his purple flames are going to send me into a purple rage. We'll talk more about components and resistances and augments in the later videos for this build, but just for now, remember only 1 point into Righteous Fervor itself, and you can put in anywhere from 2 to 5 into Consecration for the bonuses to your attack speed, your elemental resistance, and your defensive abilities. All going to be very important, maybe just not apparent right away. After that, there is Presence of Virtue, and Presence of Virtue is just a passive that will always be activated. Ultimately, this is one of those passives that we're going to want to activate for devotions. Being that devotions aren't going to play a huge part in this build until the next video, we're not going to jump too hard at it, but a lot of devotions in the tree that you have access to do require you to affix a passive ability to them. So, the easiest one in the Oathkeeper tree is Presence of Virtue. There's no activation requirements, it's just going on all the time. So you set this one up, hook it up to a devotion, and get the bonuses from the devotion ability. It also comes with a flat offensive ability buff, and gives you physical damage retaliation as well. The ability itself is very, very good, but you don't have to worry about losing a lot of points into it early on while sacrificing those points from Fire's Might. You also still have to build up both of your mastery bars before you hit level 50, so wasting points in abilities that aren't going to be incredibly useful in the normal game type doesn't make a lot of sense. That being said, Presence of Virtue is still incredibly good for what it is going to be doing later on when we need to crit people more often, and when we get hit, we can hit them right back. After that, there is also Resilience. Resilience is kind of in the same boat as Presence of Virtue, but Resilience ultimately only activates when your health drops below 66%. It's got a 15-second cooldown, which is a little bit lame, and a 5-second duration, but when this ability activates, you get a % increase to your defensive ability, you get physical resistance, and an increase into all of your maximum resistances. So this is an incredibly strong defensive passive, but we're not going to take too many points into it because we're not at a stage of the game where that is going to affect drastically how we play. One thing that will affect us pretty drastically in the early game anyway is called Ascension. Ascension is the last ability that we are going to take on the Oathkeeper tree, and that is because this ability is going to offer you up some damage absorption, which is basically a shield, and you are going to get retaliation damage from it as well. The reason Ascension is so good is because that damage absorption coupled with the damage that you will do back to it synergizes incredibly well as a melee character who will be very close to enemies, dashing in and all over the place with your Fire's Might. Now, you don't need too many points in this. I right now have 5 and I am feeling very good about it. The duration on the ability is long enough that it feels effective even if the cooldown is more than twice that amount. Ascension does just feel very strong for the early game in order for you to deal damage while you are taking damage. So that in and of itself I think speaks volumes for the ability. It's just an extra button you have to push, and if you're anything like me, you like seeing that hotbar filled up with abilities as it is, so go ahead, pick it up, do your thing. You'll also take 1 point into Clarity of Purpose, which is the only modifier for Ascension, and that is going to give you a percentage increase to offensive ability along with a whole bunch of leech resistance for both your life and energy, and reducing your stun, freeze, petrify, and entrapment duration. Pretty nuts, all the things that the one modifier can do, and it's going to be even more useful later on, but at least for the early game, the stats that it provides right off the rip with just 1 point are perfectly worth it, and you don't have to think too hard after that. Since we've gone through all of the Oathkeeper abilities, we're going to shift gears over to the Nightblade tree right now, because your Dervish, again, that's going to be an Oathkeeper and Nightblade combination. The good news about the Nightblade tree is that there is only one real skill that requires you to put a whole bunch of points in, and the rest can really get away with only 1 or maybe 2. And depending on the gear that you find along the way, you'll probably be able to get this up pretty quick with some +1 to all Nightblade skills. But that being said, the ability that you'll want to focus on the most is actually just a modifier for the ability Veil of Shadow. Veil of Shadow is just a passive ability for your Nightblade tree, and only 1 point is required to even activate it. When you do this, you're going to get a 3.4 meter radius of offensive ability reduction and total speed reduction for anybody around you. Now, the reason that you only put 1 point into that is because those skills in particular are not going to, or sorry, those traits in particular are not going to be as important early on in the game. What you'll want to put those points into instead is the modifier Night's Chill. Night's Chill is just a straight damage in an AoE equipped to this passive, and it is going to be reducing the resistances for the damage that it does for the enemies in that radius. So since you're a melee character anyway, this damage is going to be happening all the time, and this resistance shred is also going to be happening all the time. As it is right now, Night's Chill, we've got it maxed out, and it's doing 95 cold damage and 136 frostburn damage over 2 seconds, which is pretty nuts considering that every second we're hitting almost 70 damage in frostburn, which is just shy of the cold damage on the other side of things. So it's just a ton of ice-focused damage, which is, at the end of all things, the damage type that you're going to want for this build. It's going to be almost completely cold focused, and those two are going to be making an appearance in the later parts of the game in all of our gear, in all of our devotions, everything that we can possibly get. So, that said, max out Night's Chill as your first Nightblade ability, and then you can start focusing on the other stuff in this kit that will be doing cold damage, will be supporting you in some sort of defensive or utility option, or your mobility skills. Now, after you've got Night's Chill taken care of, you're going to want to put skill points into Pneumatic Burst as your heal button. Because this is a melee class, and because we don't have a shield or a whole lot of armor coming from all of our gear, having Pneumatic Burst and having a button that you can press in order to get right back up to full health is incredibly important. Pneumatic Burst is going to give you a percentage of your health restored, but it's also going to give you offensive ability, and it's going to give you speed, total speed, on top of everything else. You'll want to get this ability up to about level 4 or 5, and depending on the gear that you pick up, you may not have to put more than 1 point in to even do that. On top of that, you'll also take Shadow Dance, which is the second modifier for Pneumatic Burst, not counting Breath of Belgothian, because you don't want that. This is not a melee dual wielding build, so go right into Shadow Dance. Shadow Dance gives you a flat defensive ability, and it gives you a very big chance to avoid both melee and projectile attacks. That's your deflect and your dodge chance, and both of those are getting a big bump with just a couple points into Shadow Dance. It's really good. You're also reducing your entrapment duration, so if you remember from the Oathkeeper side of things, we are also reducing some of that duration with our Clarity of Purpose. So that's the Ascension modifier. When we have these two things going, our entrapment duration is reduced by almost 30-40%, depending on what level both of those things are at, but being trapped is a lot more difficult for a melee character, which is fantastic. All that said, it's very simple. I'll say it in every Nightblade build that I ever make. unless the other class also has a heal button, this will be the one you'll take on almost every Nightblade build, especially if they are melee, because the heal is fantastic, and all of the extra stats that you get along with these two modifiers are fantastic as well. Now, cruising right on down the passive side of things on the Nightblade still, we're going to pick up Phantasmal Armor. This one you're going to want to put at least 6 to 7 points into, because Phantasmal Armor comes with quite a few stats that are going to be good in the early as well as the late stages of the game, and those are going to be, number one, the energy absorbed from enemy spells. I know that probably doesn't sound super flashy, but when you take Phantasmal Armor and you're being attacked by enemies with abilities, your energy consumption is going to go a lot slower than it would normally. This build, especially early on, is going to be very energy hungry, and in order to counteract that, you're going to want to use Phantasmal Armor in conjunction with a couple of the ectoplasm components for your rings and your amulet. This is going to make it so that your Vire's Might isn't killing your entire energy bar with 4 to 5 uses. You want to be able to use it as much as possible, so this is a component of making that work. Not only that though, you're getting armor, you're getting pierce resistance, you're getting reductions to freeze and petrify duration, and on top of the energy absorbed from spells, you're getting a 33% chance at energy leech retaliation. What that means is that when enemies attack you, you have a 1 in 3 a chance basically to get 124 energy from them to fill your bar back up, which is really important, again, for all those reasons that I just mentioned. Phantasmal Armor is going to do nothing but get better, and once you move on to Act 2 of this playthrough, at least through your normal playthrough, enemies start getting a lot more piercing damage, and they start hurting a lot more with that damage type, so increasing your pierce resistance through the means of your Nightblade kit is very good, and is going to make you much more survivable when you start coming across more bandits, when you start coming across more skeleton archers, everybody who is just out to blast you with that type of damage. Now that being said, again, not a super flashy ability, so you're going to go into Anatomy of Murder next, which is just a stat ball button. You're only going to put 1 point into it, and the reason that you are going to do that is not for anything other than the percent increase to cunning. The percent increase to, damage to humans is fine too, especially in Act 2, there's more bandits. Being able to do an increased amount of damage to them is good, but the increase to cunning is more important. Because cunning dictates a better increase to your offensive ability than your physique and your spirit, that means you're going to be able to crit people more often, and having even just 1 point, even in the early parts of the game, a percentage increase to cunning is going to let you crit harder, do more damage, and ultimately get through the early part of the game quicker. So take the 1 point, wait until you get to late game to start maxing this out, but at least for the time being, remember, it's not flashy, it's a passive, it's increasing your damage, but it's going to be kind of hard to tell that it's doing that. Now, we did talk about Pneumatic Burst as an active, but there are 3 other active abilities that you are going to take on the Nightblade tree. I'm sure you all know it by now, but the first one is Blade Barrier, and this requires 0 explanation if you have ever played a Nightblade or watched a Grimdawn video about a Nightblade before. Blade Barrier can literally save lives with 1 point, making you completely invincible for its 3-second duration, and you're getting a bunch of health regen while that's going. Not only that, but you've got physical damage retaliation over that 3 seconds, which isn't the purpose of Blade Barrier, but ultimately it is very, very good when you get cornered, when you get close to dead, or when you just see your inevitable death racing towards your face at light speed. Hit the Blade Barrier, live to fight another day, and start slamming that dodge button when you get done with it. After Blade Barrier, you're going to pick up Shadow Strike. Shadow Strike may seem a little bit redundant because our kit is completely focused on Vire's Might, but Shadow Strike in and of itself is a very, very strong mobility tool and should be taken, I think, in any Nightblade build. And unless you're using a Nightblade as a ranged class, Shadow Strike is going to do monumentous amounts of good for any type of melee class with it. Shadow Strike is a point and click. You do have to have a target, but depending on where the target is on the screen, you can travel ridiculous distances with this ability, and it is cold and piercing damage. It also stuns the target that you hit for 1.5 seconds, but that's ultimately not what we're interested in it for. When the game finally rolls around to its latest period, we're going to pick up Nightfall. We're going to invest a bunch of points into both Shadow Strike and Nightfall to make sure that the cold damage Shadow Strike is doing is big and it hurts lots of enemies in a clump, and that's going to couple incredibly well with Vire's Might to be kind of a 1-2 punch. After that happens though, you will move on to Ring of Steel. Ring of Steel is that's going to be your big, angry AoE knife button. So once you get Shadow Strike, take Ring of Steel. We're going to take Amarasta's Blade Burst last, but it is going to be useful. Ring of Steel, you'll want 1 point into that, and you'll also want 1 point into Ring of Frost. Ring of Frost converts all of the piercing damage on Ring of Steel into cold damage, and considering that Ring of Steel is weapon and piercing damage as far as its entire damage type, changing all that to cold is very important. And then you are going to freeze the target for 2.8 seconds at level 1. Well, there's only one level, so you'll put that in. You'll get about 3 seconds of freezing targets with your Ring of Frost, and any amount of CC on a big AoE ability is going to be very, very good. You'll put on devotion abilities to this skill as well. So if you are going to end up taking Tsunami, which I do believe is a good thing to do early on, we'll talk about devotions more in depth next video, but Tsunami always very, very good early game because it's doing cold damage. It is very easy to activate, especially with an AoE ability like Ring of Steel, and it is very cheap, or I guess efficient is probably the better word compared to some of the other early devotions. So you're going to get an activatable about it, you're going to get a bunch of damage that we need in this build, and you aren't going to have to spend an arm and a leg in devotion points to get to it. That being said, that's just kind of quick and dirty on Tsunami and how well it works with your Ring of Steel. But you could also equip the Vire's Might and you'll have about the same success rate. It's just a little bit more guaranteed when you use Ring of Steel because you can hit multiple people very close to you in an AoE. Now, talking about Amarasta's Blade Burst as the very last ability on the Nightblade tree, this is basically an auto attack reset type of ability. You don't actually equip this to your auto attack. It does have a cooldown of about 2 seconds, but when you use this, your character will go into an animation in which they will swing their sword or their melee weapon just like they would any other auto attack. But when you do that, you're going to whip out a bunch of weapon damage, cold and frostburn damage, and you have a chance to freeze the target that you hit for 1 second. It is an AoE ability. It is in about the same AoE that your Veil of Shadow is, so anybody close enough to be hit by your Amarasta's Blade Burst is also going to be hit by your Veil of Shadow, at least for now. If we want to go later in the game and increase the radius of Veil of Shadow, that's a possibility, but it's not super necessary at the moment. But more importantly, Blade Burst is just that cherry on top. After you've blown the rest of your abilities, if everything else is on cooldown, Blade Burst is just there to clean up what is left, and you don't need more than 1 point in order to access it. You'll also take 1 point into Lethal Assault, however, which is going to activate every time that you use Amarasta's Blade Burst, and this is additional damage over an 8-second duration of both cold and acid damage. Acid damage not a big deal. It comes with some of the Nightblade abilities. You shouldn't worry too much about having it because more is always good, but cold is what we're focusing on here. Lethal Assault is adding more cold damage to you passively when you use your Blade Burst, and that in and of itself is incredibly good because all of our damaging abilities in this build are going to work off of that damage type, making things infinitely more impactful. But that will do it for all of the abilities in this video. Because we're so early on in the way that this is going to go, remember that you don't have to worry super hard about gear, and you don't have to worry super hard about devotions until you hit about level 50. That's the next video in this series on this build, so we'll talk super in-depth once we hit level 50. I'll show you all the gear that is important to that power spike. We'll start talking about devotions, and I will jump into the path of relics. We're going to create... we've got a specific path of cold-focused relics that are going to buff this character up quite a bit, and we can dive a little bit deeper into the monster infrequent that comes with this build from our buddy Lord Alchemos the Executioner. There are other monster infrequents in the Steps of Torment too, so once we get to that point, I'll start running those dungeons, show you where you're going to pick these things up, and you can start farming them to your heart's content. That's it for me though, everybody. Thanks so much for hanging out. I will see you guys next time. Peace out.